Shaq wasn't the kind of man who stopped for just anything. But that night, something made him slow down. An elderly woman, hunched over on a dimly lit street corner, selling flowers long after the city had gone quiet. There was something off about her. The way her hands trembled. The way she flinched when certain cars passed. The way her tired eyes constantly scanned the shadows. When Shaq bought a flower and gently asked why she was out so late, she forced a smile, dodging the question. But just as he turned to leave, he caught it. A black SUV creeping down the street. A man inside watching her like a predator. This wasn't just a woman selling flowers. This was someone running from something. Or someone. And Shaq? He had just stepped into a story that was far from over. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city hummed with late-night energy, cars rushing past, neon signs flickering, the distant chatter of people finishing their evening plans. Big Shaq had just stepped out of a high-profile business meeting, his mind still occupied with numbers, deals, and negotiations. But something made him stop. Across the street, an elderly woman stood beneath a flickering streetlight, her hands gripping a basket of roses. Her small, makeshift flower stand was simple, just a wooden crate, a few faded price signs, and a bouquet of carefully arranged roses in a plastic bucket. It wasn't the sight of someone selling flowers that caught Shaq's attention. It was the way she carried herself. She wasn't calling out to customers. She wasn't smiling. Instead, her shoulders were tense, her eyes scanning the street nervously. Every time a car slowed down near her, she subtly flinched, as if expecting something. Or someone. Shaq took a step closer, observing. The way her frail hands trembled as she adjusted a rose. The way her lips moved slightly, whispering something under her breath. Not a sales pitch, but a prayer. Something wasn't right. Shaq walked across the street, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. As he approached, the woman looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to actually stop. "Beautiful flowers," he said, his voice calm but curious. She hesitated, then forced a small smile. "Roses, $5 each." Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a 20. "I'll take 4. The woman fumbled slightly as she picked out the best roses, wrapping them in a thin sheet of paper. Her hands still shook. Shaq accepted the bouquet but didn't walk away. Instead, he looked at her, studying the deep lines on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's pretty late," he said casually. "Do you always sell this late at night?" The woman stiffened, just for a second. It was quick, but Shaq noticed. I do what I have to," she said, avoiding his gaze. Shaq nodded slowly. "Must be tough." She swallowed. "It is. But work is work." She was lying, not about working hard, but about why she was really out here. Shaq had spent years negotiating with people, reading their tells, seeing what they weren't saying. And this woman? She was terrified of something. Shaq didn't press further. Instead, he took the flowers, nodded politely, and walked away. But he didn't leave. He leaned against his car a few feet away, pretending to check his phone while keeping his eyes on her. And that's when it happened. A black SUV slowed down as it approached her stand. It didn't stop, didn't roll down a window, just moved painfully slow. The woman's entire posture changed. Her grip tightened around her basket. Her breathing quickened. She didn't turn to look at the car. She didn't have to. Whoever was inside, she already knew. And she was afraid. Shaq narrowed his eyes, watching. The SUV idled for a few more seconds before finally pulling away. Only then did the woman exhale shakily, closing her eyes for just a moment, as if regaining her composure. Shaq had seen enough. This wasn't just an elderly woman trying to make ends meet. This was someone running from something. Shaq slid into his car, gripping the steering wheel but not starting the engine. His mind worked quickly, connecting dots that didn't fully exist yet. Who was she really? Why was she out here so late, alone, with fear written all over her face? And more importantly, who was watching her? He glanced at the flowers sitting on the passenger seat. Something about this felt off, but he didn't have enough pieces yet. So he made a decision. Tomorrow night? He was coming back, and this time he wasn't just buying roses. He was getting answers. The next evening, Shaq returned to the same spot, parking his car nearby. The woman was there again. Same crate, same bucket of roses. But this time, she looked even more on edge. Her fingers fidgeted with the petals. She checked her watch too often. Her eyes flicked toward the street every few seconds. Shaq approached again, this time more direct. "Evening," he greeted. "I'd like another bouquet." She barely looked at him as she wrapped the flowers. "You were here yesterday." Shaq nodded. "That a problem?" "No," she said too quickly. "Just, not many people come back." Shaq took the roses, but didn't leave. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice softer this time. The woman's hands froze. For a split second, she looked like she might break. But then, she pulled herself together. "I'm fine." She forced a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired." Shaq held her gaze. "You sure?" Another hesitation, another flicker of fear. Then, a decision. "I need to go," she said abruptly, grabbing her basket and packing up as fast as she could. Shaq stepped back, letting her leave. But this time, he didn't walk away. Instead, he followed. The woman turned down a side street, moving quicker than someone her age should. Shaq followed at a distance, blending into the sidewalk crowd. She reached a narrow alleyway, glancing over her shoulder before slipping into the shadows. Shaq hesitated, then moved forward. But just as he neared the alley, the black SUV from last night pulled up. Shaq froze. This time, the passenger window rolled down. A man sat inside, slicked back hair, expensive suit, cold expression. He locked eyes with Shaq and smirked. "You should stop asking questions, Mr. Shaq. His voice was smooth, controlled. "This isn't your problem." Shaq's jaw clenched. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low. The man chuckled. "Just someone keeping an eye on things." The SUV pulled away before Shaq could respond. But the message was clear. They knew he was watching. And now, they were watching him back. Shaq stood at the edge of the alley, his mind racing. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a woman selling flowers. This was something bigger. And Shaq? He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not until he knew the truth. Shaq sat in his car across the street, the engine idling softly. The city pulsed around him. Streetlights flickered, cars honked in the distance, and pedestrians bustled about, lost in their own lives. But his focus was locked on one person, Eleanor. She was back in the same spot, her small crate of roses placed carefully at her feet. Her hands moved methodically, but her eyes? They never stayed in one place for long. She scanned the street constantly, tensed at the sound of approaching footsteps, and stiffened whenever a car slowed near her stand. Shaq exhaled slowly. He'd seen this kind of fear before. This wasn't just a woman struggling to make ends meet. This was someone hiding in plain sight. Last night had confirmed one thing. She was afraid of someone. And tonight, Shaq was going to find out who. Shaq stepped out of his car and made his way toward Eleanor. She noticed him immediately, but this time she didn't look startled. Instead, there was a brief flicker of recognition. Not relief, not comfort. Just recognition. "Back again?" she asked, her voice even. Shaq nodded, pulling out his wallet. "Your flowers must be good luck. I had a great day after buying them." Eleanor gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Roses always bring good fortune." Shaq handed her a 20. "I'll take the whole bouquet this time." Her hands hesitated around the flowers. "That's too much." "Call it an investment," Shaq said, his tone light, but his gaze sharp. "I figure if I keep buying, you won't have to work so late." Eleanor didn't respond. Instead, she carefully wrapped the bouquet and handed it over. Shaq took it, but didn't move. "You always work at night?" he asked casually. Eleanor stiffened. Just a little. "It's when the flowers sell best." Shaq arched a brow. "Really? I always thought mornings were better. People picking up flowers for loved ones, celebrations, apologies. Seems like an odd business model." Eleanor's fingers tensed around the edges of the crate. "I manage." Shaq watched her, taking in every tiny reaction. She wasn't just working late out of necessity. She was avoiding something. Or someone. Shaq adjusted the bouquet in his grip. Ever thought of moving locations? Maybe a spot with more foot traffic? Eleanor shook her head immediately. Number I stay here. That a preference or a rule? Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer. Shaq sighed. You live around here? Eleanor hesitated again. Then, yes. It was a lie. Shaq could hear it. Something in her voice was too careful. Family? He asked, keeping his tone neutral. My husband passed away, she said softly. That part wasn't a lie. Shaq could hear the raw emotion behind those words. I'm sorry, he said genuinely. How long ago? Eleanor swallowed hard. A while. Another vague answer. Shaq watched her closely. She was being deliberate, saying enough to shut down questions, but not enough to invite more. Then, he decided to test something. You ever go to the police for help? Eleanor flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Shaq's jaw tightened. That reaction told him everything he needed to know. Whoever she was afraid of, the police weren't an option. Before Shaq could push further, Eleanor suddenly glanced at her watch. A flicker of panic crossed her face. She grabbed her basket, her hands moving frantically. I need to go. Shaq frowned. What's wrong? I have to go, she repeated, shoving the remaining flowers into her bag. Her breathing had quickened. Something had just changed. Shaq stepped back, watching as she slung the basket over her shoulder and disappeared into the alleyway behind her. That's when he realized. She wasn't just leaving. She was running. And Shaq wasn't about to let her go without answers. He moved quickly, following her path, his footsteps light against the pavement. The alley was dark, the buildings on either side casting long shadows. Eleanor's silhouette moved ahead, her pace fast but unsteady. Shaq was about to call out when he stopped dead in his tracks. A black SUV was parked at the end of the alley, the same one from last night. And this time, the man inside wasn't just watching Eleanor. He was watching Shaq. The window rolled down, and Shaq got his first good look at him. Late 40s, slicked back hair, a sharp suit, expensive but understated. A face that didn't belong to a street thug, but to someone used to operating behind the scenes. The man smirked. You're persistent. Shaq didn't respond. He kept his expression unreadable, his body relaxed but prepared. The man tilted his head slightly. I'd suggest you stop asking questions. Mr. Shaq arched a brow. That's supposed to scare me? The man chuckled. Number just a friendly warning. Shaq exhaled slowly. See, here's the problem with that. I don't take kindly to warnings, and I really don't like men who lurk in cars, watching elderly women like they own them. The man's smirk remained, but there was something colder in his eyes now. You think you know what's going on here? Shaq took a slow step forward. I know enough. The man leaned slightly out. Shaq sat in his dimly lit office, a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk beside him. His laptop screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating his focused expression. He had spent the last 2 hours digging into Eleanor's past, and what he found left him with more questions than answers. Richard Caldwell. The name carried weight. A once powerful businessman, Caldwell had been at the center of multiple industries, real estate, finance, even pharmaceuticals. A man with influence, wealth, and the kind of connections that made him untouchable. Then one day, he vanished. No funeral, no records of his death, no public statements. Just gone. And now, his wife, the woman who should have inherited his empire, was selling flowers on the street, afraid of something. Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. None of this made sense. Powerful men didn't just disappear, unless someone wanted them gone. Shaq clicked through online archives, scrolling past old photos of Richard Caldwell at galas and board meetings, standing beside politicians and investors. The man had been a ghost for nearly a decade, but before that, he was everywhere. Then, silence. The last official mention of him was 9 years ago in a vague news article. Billionaire Richard Caldwell's sudden absence leaves investors uncertain. Family declines to comment. That was it. No follow-ups, no speculation. like the world had agreed to forget he ever existed. Shaq frowned. That wasn't natural. Someone had erased Richard Caldwell. But why? And more importantly, why was Eleanor still paying the price? Shaq leaned forward, tapping his fingers against the desk. There were only two possibilities. 1. Richard Caldwell was dead, and someone powerful had made sure it stayed quiet. 2. He was alive. But if that were the case, why was Eleanor struggling to survive? Shaq needed answers, and the only person who had them was Eleanor. That night, Shaq drove back to Eleanor's usual spot. The street was quieter than before, a soft drizzle misting the pavement. The neon lights of nearby stores reflected on the wet asphalt, casting a hazy glow. But Eleanor wasn't there. Her usual crate of flowers was missing. The corner she stood at. Empty. Shaq's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. He parked his car and stepped out, scanning the area. No sign of her. No sign of a struggle. Just gone. A deep sense of unease settled over him. He had a bad feeling about this. Then, movement. Across the street, beneath the shadow of a street lamp, stood a man in a dark suit. He wasn't holding flowers. He was waiting. For Shaq. Shaq didn't hesitate. He crossed the street, closing the distance between them. The man was tall, clean-shaven, with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch that glinted under the streetlight. He had the look of someone who belonged in boardrooms, not street corners. "Evening, Mr. Shaq," the man said smoothly, his voice calm. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Where's Eleanor?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not the question you should be asking." Shaq stepped closer, his presence towering. "Try me." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked. Like this was a game. "You've been looking into things you shouldn't," the man continued, adjusting his cufflinks. "And that's problematic." Shaq's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about intimidation. This was about control. "I don't like problems," Shaq said coolly. "I like solutions. So how about you tell me where Eleanor is, and we call it a night?" The man let out a slow exhale, almost amused. "You don't get it, do you?" Shaq stayed silent. The man took a step forward, lowering his voice. "This isn't your problem." Shaq held his ground. "It is now." For the first time, the man's smirk faltered. "Walk away, Shaq." His voice was lower now, more serious. "Forget about Eleanor. Forget about Caldwell." Shaq narrowed his eyes. The man had said Caldwell, not Richard Caldwell. That meant Richard wasn't the only Caldwell they were watching. That meant Eleanor wasn't just a widow, she was a loose end. Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "Funny thing about warnings. I don't take them well." The man's smirk returned. "That's unfortunate." Then, just as smoothly as he had arrived, the man turned and walked toward the black SUV parked a few feet away, the same SUV that had been watching Eleanor for days. He climbed in, and the vehicle pulled away into the night, leaving Shaq standing in the rain. Shaq didn't move for a long moment. His mind was working too fast. Eleanor wasn't just a grieving wife. Richard Caldwell wasn't just a missing man. And now, someone wanted Shaq to walk away, which meant one thing. He was getting close to the truth. Shaq pulled out his phone, dialing a number. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. "Shaq, didn't expect to hear from you this late." "I need a favor," Shaq said, watching the direction the SUV had gone. "I need to find someone. Fast." "Who?" Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. "Eleanor Caldwell." A pause. Then, "I'll see what I can do." Shaq slid back into his car, gripping the steering wheel as the rain picked up. This wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. This was about power, money, control. And now, he had a choice. Let it go. Walk away, like the man had warned. Or keep digging. And find out what really happened to Richard Caldwell. Shaq exhaled slowly. The choice was already made. He wasn't stopping until he had the truth. Shaq parked his car in front of what used to be a grand estate. Now it was just a skeleton of its former glory. The once pristine driveway was cracked, weeds pushing through the cement. The iron gate was rusted, hanging off its hinges. The mansion itself, a place that must have once been the pinnacle of wealth and power, stood abandoned, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. But despite its decay, something felt off. Shaq stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching against broken glass as he approached the entrance. This was the last known address of Richard Caldwell, the man who had vanished. And if Eleanor had any remaining ties to her husband's past, this place might hold the answers. Pushing the heavy front door open, Shaq stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and neglect. The grand staircase in the center of the room was warped, its once polished banisters now chipped and broken. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring out with empty eyes. The place had been left to rot. Shaq moved cautiously, his instincts telling him that despite the abandoned state of the house, he wasn't alone. Something had brought him here. And something, or someone, had been here recently. As Shaq walked further inside, he noticed something small but important. Footprints. They weren't old. The thin layer of dust coating the marble floor had been disturbed. Someone had been here. Recently. Shaq crouched down, examining the pattern. 2 sets of prints, one lighter, one heavier. One person had been careful, stepping lightly. The other? Not so much. Shaq followed the trail, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. Whoever had been here last was looking for something, and Shaq had a feeling he was about to find out what. The footprints led him to a grand study, its massive bookshelves still filled with dusty volumes. The desk was overturned, drawers pulled open. Someone had been searching. Shaq's eyes scanned the room, his gut telling him something was off. Then, he saw it. A large bookshelf positioned just slightly askew, as if it had been moved. Shaq stepped closer, gripping the edge of the shelf. With a sharp tug, it slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall. And inside, a safe. Locked. Untouched. And still here after all this time. Shaq exhaled slowly. Whatever was inside, someone wanted it forgotten. Shaq wasn't one to waste time. Pulling out a small toolkit from his pocket, he got to work. Years of high-stakes business had taught him that not all locks are physical, and sometimes knowing how to crack one is the only way to get real answers. The combination lock was old, but not impossible. Within minutes, a soft click sounded in the silence. Shaq pulled the door open. And inside, Richard Caldwell's past, preserved in ink and paper. Shaq carefully pulled out the contents of the safe. Newspaper clippings, bank statements, confidential documents. Some were decades old. Others, much more recent. Shaq skimmed through them, his pulse quickening. One headline stood out. Billionaire businessman disappears without a trace, presumed dead or in hiding. Shaq frowned. He flipped through more papers, piecing the puzzle together. Richard Caldwell hadn't just vanished. He had been erased. Shaq dug deeper, scanning the bank statements. Massive transactions, some legitimate, others highly questionable. Offshore accounts, sudden cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. And then, a list of names, powerful names, people in politics, in finance, even law enforcement. And beside certain names, a single red X. Shaq exhaled sharply. Richard Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something dangerous, something people would kill to keep quiet. And now? His wife Eleanor was still paying the price. Shaq flipped to the final page, a letter, handwritten, dated 1 week before Richard vanished. Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I failed. You need to leave. They won't stop. Not for me. Not for you. I kept records. I thought they'd be enough to protect us. But if you're reading this, I was wrong. I love you. Please don't look for me. Don't let them find you. Shaq's jaw clenched. Richard Caldwell had known he was being hunted, and he had tried to warn Eleanor. But if she had found this letter, why was she still out on the streets, selling flowers, looking over her shoulder like a hunted animal? Unless someone had already found her. And now, they knew Shaq was looking too. Shaq stood, his mind racing. If someone else had been here before him, what did they take? And more importantly, What were they still looking for? He needed to find Eleanor. Now grabbing his phone, he dialed the contact who had helped him last time. Find her, Shaq said the moment the line connected. Whatever it takes. A pause. Then, I'll call you when I have something. Shaq hung up and clenched his fists. This wasn't just about Richard Caldwell's past. This was about Eleanor's future. And Shaq wasn't letting her become the next name with a red X beside it. Shaq stepped closer, gripping the edge of the shelf. With a sharp tug, it slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall. And inside, a safe, locked, untouched, and still here after all this time. Shaq exhaled slowly. Whatever was inside, someone wanted it forgotten. Shaq wasn't one to waste time. Pulling out a small toolkit from his pocket, he got to work. Years of high-stakes business had taught him that not all locks are physical, and sometimes, knowing how to crack one is the only way to get real answers. The combination lock was old, but not impossible. Within minutes, a soft click sounded in the silence. Shaq pulled the door open, and inside, Richard Caldwell's past, preserved in ink and paper. Shaq carefully pulled out the contents of the safe: newspaper clippings, bank statements, confidential documents. Some were decades old. Others, much more recent. Shaq skimmed through them, his pulse quickening. One headline stood out: "Billionaire businessman disappears without a trace, presumed dead or in hiding." Shaq frowned. He flipped through more papers, piecing the puzzle together. Richard Caldwell hadn't just vanished. He had been erased. Shaq dug deeper, scanning the bank statements. Massive transactions, some legitimate, others highly questionable. Offshore accounts, sudden cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. And then, a list of names. Powerful names, people in politics, in finance, even law enforcement. And beside certain names, a single red X. Shaq exhaled sharply. Richard Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something dangerous. Something people would kill to keep quiet. And now, his wife Eleanor was still paying the price. Shaq flipped to the final page, a letter, handwritten, dated 1 week before Richard vanished. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I failed. You need to leave. They won't stop. Not for me, not for you. I kept records. I thought they'd be enough to protect us. But if you're reading this, I was wrong. I love you. Please don't look for me. Don't let them find you." Shaq's jaw clenched. Richard Caldwell had known he was being hunted, and he had tried to warn Eleanor. But if she had found this letter, why was she still out on the streets, selling flowers, looking over her shoulder like a hunted animal? Unless someone had already found her. And now, they knew Shaq was looking too. Shaq stood, his mind racing. If someone else had been here before him, what did they take? And more importantly, what were they still looking for? He needed to find Eleanor. Now grabbing his phone, he dialed the contact who had helped him last time. "Find her," Shaq said the moment the line connected. "Whatever it takes." A pause. Then, "I'll call you when I have something." Shaq hung up and clenched his fists. This wasn't just about Richard Caldwell's past. This was about Eleanor's future. And Shaq wasn't letting her become the next name with a red X beside it. Shaq had been looking for Eleanor all night. She hadn't returned to her usual spot. No flower stand, no quiet presence on the corner, just an empty space where she should have been. And after what he had just discovered, that Richard Caldwell wasn't just a missing man, but someone who had stolen millions from people who don't forgive. Eleanor wasn't just missing. She was in danger. Shaq clenched his jaw as he drove through the quiet streets, scanning every darkened alley and shadowed storefront. And then, finally, he found her. Eleanor sat on a worn-down bench outside a closed convenience store, her hands trembling in her lap. Her face was bruised, a small cut above her eyebrow, her lower lip swollen. She had been attacked. Shaq's chest tightened with quiet fury. He pulled over and stepped out, approaching slowly. Eleanor barely lifted her head. "Eleanor." His voice was steady, but the concern in it was clear. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, tired and full of something far worse than fear. Resignation. Like she had already decided this was how her story ended. Shaq didn't accept that. He sat beside her, giving her space but making it clear. He wasn't leaving without answers. For a long time, Eleanor said nothing. Just stared at the cracks in the pavement, her fingers gripping the tattered hem of her coat. Shaq didn't push. He let the silence settle, let her decide when she was ready. Then finally, she spoke. "You should have walked away," she whispered. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Not my style." Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "Then you're a fool." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe. But I'm not the one sitting here, bleeding, because someone thinks I owe them something." Eleanor flinched. He had hit the truth. She swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists. "It's not me they want." Shaq waited. Then, finally, the dam broke. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her voice raw. "Richard wasn't just my husband. He was a man who made powerful enemies." Shaq stayed quiet, letting her continue. "Before he vanished, he stole something. A lot of something." She swallowed. "Millions. From the wrong people." Shaq's jaw clenched. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed, it hit different. She closed her eyes. "For years they left me alone. Maybe they assumed I had nothing to do with it. Or maybe they believed he really was dead." Her voice cracked on the last word. Shaq's hands tightened into fists. Eleanor had been running from a debt that wasn't hers. But recently, someone had decided she was the one who had to pay. Eleanor looked up, her eyes searching Shaq's. "They want their money." Shaq nodded slowly. "And they think you have it?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look like I have millions?" Shaq exhaled, his mind working fast. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about unfinished business. Whoever Richard Caldwell had stolen from, they weren't satisfied with his disappearance. They wanted to collect. Shaq ran a hand over his jaw. "Who's after you?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, "I don't know their names, just that they never stop watching." Shaq's stomach tightened. That explained the black SUV, the man in the suit, the fear that never left her eyes. She turned to him, eyes haunted. "They won't let me live. Not until they have what's theirs." Then, she whispered something that made Shaq's blood run cold. "Richard isn't dead." Shaq stilled. Eleanor looked away. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Shaq's mind raced. He had read Richard Caldwell's letter. A farewell, a warning, a goodbye from a man who knew his time was up. But now, Eleanor was telling him that Richard was still out there, alive, hiding. And if that were true, who else knew? Shaq took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "Eleanor, if Richard is alive, why are they coming after you?" She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "Because they think I know where he is." Shaq clenched his fists. Of course, the people hunting her weren't just trying to collect. They were trying to flush Richard Caldwell out of hiding, by using his wife as bait. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know where he is, Shaq. I swear it." Shaq studied her face. The exhaustion, the pain, the honesty. She wasn't lying. But that didn't matter. Because the people chasing her, they wouldn't believe her. Shaq exhaled, running a hand down his face. This had just gone from bad to worse. Eleanor was being hunted for information she didn't have. And Richard Caldwell, the man who started all of this, was still out there. Shaq looked at Eleanor, his voice firm. "You're not running anymore." Eleanor's lips parted slightly. "Shaq, no." His tone was final. "I don't care who these people are. I don't care what Richard did. They don't get to use you as leverage." She let out a shaky breath. "What are you saying?" Shaq met her gaze, unwavering. "I'm saying we end this." And for the first time in years, Eleanor had hope. Shaq sat in his car, engine idling, watching the building across the street. The address he had been given led him to a sleek, modern office tower in the heart of the city, a place that reeked of power, control, and untouchable influence. This wasn't the hideout of small-time loan sharks. This was something bigger. Inside those glass walls were the men who had been hunting Eleanor, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. And Shaq was about to walk straight into their world. After hours of digging, Shaq had found something unsettling. The people after Eleanor weren't just criminals. They were businessmen, politicians, investors, people with clean records, private jets, and expensive suits, the kind of men who smiled at charity events while orchestrating destruction behind the scenes. And at the center of it all, Graham Langley. The name alone carried weight. A billionaire investor with hands in everything: real estate, tech, banking. On the surface, he was a respected businessman. But behind closed doors, he was the kind of man who handled problems quietly. And now, Eleanor Caldwell was his latest problem. Shaq stepped out of his car, adjusting his jacket as he approached the building. The lobby was pristine, marble floors, gold accents, the quiet hum of wealth in the air. He walked straight to the reception desk. "I have a meeting with Mr. Langley," Shaq said smoothly. The receptionist barely glanced up. "Mr. Langley doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Shaq smirked. "Tell him Big Shaq is here, and that it's about Richard Caldwell." That got her attention. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she quickly made a call. A few moments later, security arrived, but not to escort Shaq out. They led him to the elevator, straight to the top floor. Graham Langley's office was exactly what Shaq expected. Massive windows overlooking the city, dark wood, leather chairs, and the faint scent of expensive cigars. And behind the desk, Graham himself. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a custom suit. The kind of man who never had to raise his voice to command a room. He leaned back in his chair, studying Shaq with an amused expression. "Well, well," Langley said, a slow smirk forming. "Big Shaq, I've heard about you." Shaq pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited. "Then you know I don't waste time." Langley chuckled. "No, I imagine you don't." Shaq folded his hands on the desk. "I know you've been hunting Eleanor Caldwell." Langley's smirk didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes. "That's a bold accusation." Shaq tilted his head. "Cut the act. We both know Richard stole from you. But he's gone. And Eleanor? She doesn't have what you want." Langley exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. "That's the problem, isn't it? She may not have the money, but she might know where it is." Shaq nodded. "And that's why you won't let her go." Langley's smirk returned. "You catch on fast." Shaq leaned in slightly. Now came the real play. "You want Richard's money?" Shaq said. "Then let's talk business." Langley raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Shaq leaned back, completely unfazed. "I know your company is under investigation for tax fraud." Langley's smirk disappeared. Shaq continued. "You've been keeping it quiet, but it's only a matter of time before the media catches on. A scandal like that, it would cripple your investors." Langley's jaw tightened. "Careful, Shaq." Shaq smirked. "I'm just getting started." He tapped the desk. "I also know that your newest project, a luxury hotel chain, is hitting delays. You need investors. You need public confidence." Langley exhaled through his nose. "Get to the point." Shaq's expression turned sharp. "I'll make you an offer. A deal so big, so tied to your business, that backing out would be more dangerous than letting Eleanor go." Langley narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly are you offering?" Shaq smiled. "A multi-million-dollar deal. One that puts your company back in the good graces of the public. One that makes you look like a hero, not a criminal." Langley studied him, weighing the offer. "And what do you want in return?" Shaq's voice was calm, steady. "You leave Eleanor alone. For good." Langley leaned back in his chair, considering. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power. Shaq had just flipped the game. If Langley said no, Shaq would make sure every dirty secret he had came to light. If he said yes, he got to keep his empire. Langley exhaled, nodding slowly. "You're a dangerous man, Shaq." Shaq smirked. "And you're a smart one, so what's it gonna be?" A tense silence stretched between them. Then, Langley reached for his phone. "Call off the search," he said to someone on the other end. "Eleanor Caldwell is no longer our concern." Shaq relaxed slightly, but his gaze stayed sharp. "I want your word." Langley met his eyes. "You have it." Shaq stood, straightening his jacket. "Pleasure doing business with you." Langley chuckled. "You know, if you ever want to work for me..." Shaq shot him a look. Langley smirked. "Didn't think so." As Shaq walked out of the office, he knew one thing for certain. Eleanor was finally free. And Graham Langley? He had just learned that power doesn't always belong to the man with the most money. Shaq had made the deal. Eleanor was safe. But as he stepped out of Graham Langley's towering office, the weight of what had just happened settled on his shoulders. It wasn't over. Not really. Powerful men didn't like being outplayed, and Shaq had just forced one of the most dangerous players in the city to fold. As he reached the lobby, his phone buzzed. A text. "Unknown number. Walk carefully, Mr. Shaq. You just made some very powerful enemies." Shaq smirked. He had dealt with men like this before, and they always made the same mistake, thinking threats would shake him. They wouldn't. He drove through the city, his mind racing. The past few days had been a whirlwind, a mystery that had led him from a woman selling flowers in the dark to a decades-old conspiracy buried beneath corporate power. And now, Eleanor was finally free. The men hunting her had backed off. Langley had no choice but to cut his losses. But Shaq knew one thing for certain. Power never just disappears. It only shifts. And while he had won this round, there would always be another game waiting to be played. Eleanor was waiting for him outside a small cafe, a paper bag of flowers in her hands. She looked different. For the first time, her shoulders weren't hunched. Her eyes weren't darting around, looking for threats. She looked at peace. Shaq pulled up beside her, rolling down the window. "You gonna sell me another flower?" he teased. She smiled, a real smile this time. "No, I think you've done enough." She opened the door, slipping into the passenger seat. But instead of thanking him, instead of telling him how relieved she was, she pulled an envelope from her coat and set it on the dashboard. Shaq frowned. "What's this?" Eleanor inhaled, her voice soft. "Something I should have given you earlier." Shaq picked up the envelope, flipping it over. His chest tightened. It was addressed to him. And the signature at the bottom? Richard Caldwell. Shaq tore the envelope open, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was rough, but deliberate. A man who had written these words knowing they might be his last. He began to read. "Shaq, if you're reading this, it means you found her. Good. I never wanted her to be alone, but I couldn't protect her myself. Not after what I did." Shaq's grip on the letter tightened. "I know what you've been told, that I stole money, that I ran, that I left Eleanor to suffer for my mistakes. Some of that is true. Some of it isn't. What is true? I was a fool. A greedy man who thought he could cheat the devil and walk away clean. But you already know. Men like Graham Langley don't let things go." Shaq exhaled slowly, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He read on. "Eleanor was never supposed to pay for my sins, but when I realized she would, I did the only thing I could. I disappeared. For her." Shaq's jaw clenched. Richard Caldwell hadn't just run away. He had chosen exile, all to keep Eleanor safe. The final lines of the letter were scrawled with urgency, like Richard had been running out of time. "I never got to say goodbye to her. Never got to tell her she was the only thing I did right in this world. So if she's with you now, do what I never could, Shaq. Set her free." Shaq let out a slow breath, lowering the letter. Eleanor was watching him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He was always there," she whispered. "Even when I thought he was gone." Shaq nodded, folding the letter carefully. Richard had never stopped protecting her, even from the shadows. The two of them sat in silence, the city buzzing around them. Then, Eleanor inhaled deeply. "I think I'm ready to leave." Shaq glanced at her. "Where will you go?" She gave him a small smile. Anywhere but here. Shaq nodded. Good. She turned to him, her voice firm. I don't want to run anymore. I just want to live. And that was the real victory. Later that night, Shaq stood alone on his balcony, staring out at the city skyline. The deal was done. Eleanor was safe. But the game? The game never really ended. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. A text. You don't just walk away from people like us, Shaq. We'll be watching. Shaq smirked, pocketing his phone. Let them watch. He had already won. Not every battle is fought with fists. Sometimes it's fought with courage, strategy, and refusing to let the powerful prey on the weak. Eleanor spent years trapped in fear, but one choice, one person willing to stand up, changed everything. How many people do we pass by every day, too lost in our own world to notice their silent struggles? Maybe it's time we start paying attention. Maybe it's time we become the person who steps in when no one else will. Because sometimes, one act of kindness is all it takes to rewrite someone's story.